Good afternoon again. Following on our previous presentation, we would like to focus on diabetic patients on the waiting list for kidney transplantation. Thank you. We know that diabetic nephropathy is caused by both type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus, and our purpose is to record the comorbidity of patients with diabetic nephropathy on the waiting list. Out of our total sample in our center, 51 patients with insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus were studied. And the characteristics assessed were the type of diabetes mellitus, the length of stay on dialysis, the body mass index, cardiovascular morbidity, diabetic retinopathy, indication for combined kidney and pancreas transplants, and the cause of temporary exclusion from the list. In these demographics, you could see that patients were classified into two groups, 22 with type 1 diabetes and 29 with type 2. And from the demographics, we could see that the median age is 63 years old. But what is more impressive is that there is no difference between the two groups. Thus, patients with type 1 diabetes are also elder with a mean age of 62 years old. The median time spent on dialysis was 8 years, 1 year more than the general sample, and there were also no significant differences between the two groups, type 1 and type 2. And the reassessment that was recorded was considered in 30% of diabetic patients. Now, the majority of diabetic patients, about 60%, were obese, with a BMI more than 30. And again, there were no significant difference between the two groups. Thus, obesity is a big problem in this particular group of candidates. Diabetic retinopathy was recorded in the majority of diabetic patients, and cardiovascular disease affects more than 50%, with no difference between the two types of diabetes. The criteria for combined kidney and pancreas transplant, the simultaneous pancreas kidney transplantation, were met by 10% of diabetic patients, with a percentage of patients with type 1 being higher than those with type 2. That was well expected, and actually the target group for simultaneous kidney pancreas transplantation are patients with type 1. But it seems that the eligibility criteria, age less than 60 years old and BMI less than 35 in patients with diabetes type 1, are limited the number of diabetic patients that are eligible for combined kidney and pancreas transplantation. Temporary exclusion was recorded in 37% of patients, and the main reason, again, was cardiovascular diseases. And when we examined separately the two types of diabetic patients, there was no difference, slightly more cases of temporary exclusion in patients with type 2 diabetes, but the incidence is really high for both types. Our conclusions for this study is that despite the significant cardiovascular comorbidity Patients with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes remain on the list for a long period of time. And thus a significant percentage of temporary exclusion was recorded, while the advantage of both a kidney transplant and a kidney transplant combined with pancreas are not exploited, and this is a challenge to have a different policy on these candidates and perhaps put them on a priority list.